The message reached Prince William only minutes before the palace doors were due to close for the evening. Harry was not merely asking to return. He had submitted a formal demand for renewed access to the royal household, while describing himself with a title connected to Prince Philip, a designation the late Duke had personally ordered never to be inherited, revived, or used as leverage. William read the final line twice. Then his restraint broke. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe to Victoria Windsor so you don't miss a single update. William held the request, but the anger did not show. He read the signature, Guardian of the Crown. The phrase had once been linked privately to Philip's sense of duty, not to any legal rank or official position. In plain terms, it meant a personal responsibility to protect the monarchy, not a title anyone could claim. Yet Harry had placed it beneath his name as though it carried power. The prince lowered the page and asked whether his brother understood what he had done. The answer came. Harry wanted renewed access to Windsor, royal duties, and recognition as a working family member. He had also attached a handwritten note claiming their grandfather saw him as a protector who could serve the crown from outside palace walls. That was the moment William's control cracked. Harry was not simply appealing to Charles as a son. He was using Philip's memory as pressure, turning private affection into a weapon against the institution the late Duke had defended. The future king pushed back his chair and stared at the forbidden signature. An aide suggested grief had shaped the decision more than ambition. William answered without hesitation. Grief did not give anyone the right to rewrite the dead. The room fell silent. Then the orders came. William commanded that the request be frozen. Every internal copy was to lose the disputed title, while the original was moved into a restricted royal archive, a secure collection for sensitive family records and legal material. No reply would leave until the wording had been examined, the handwritten claim verified, and Charles informed. But the king learned the truth sooner than expected. Charles received a copy before the restriction took effect. He saw Harry's name, then the 3 words beneath it, and stopped reading. For William, the phrase represented a direct challenge to royal power. For the monarch, it carried his father's voice, his younger son's pain, and a warning buried for years. William had treated the title as a legal violation, but for Charles, those 3 forbidden words reopened a wound that had never truly healed. To understand why Harry's signature caused such fury, the title itself was not enough. The deeper danger lay in what Prince Philip had represented to both brothers. To William, he was discipline, endurance, and loyalty without spectacle. To Harry, he was something more complicated, a grandfather who understood rebellion but demanded responsibility. Now both men believed they were defending Philip's memory, and neither was prepared to surrender it to the other. So William remembered the late Duke as the force who held the family steady when scandal threatened to pull it apart. He rarely offered comfort through soft words. Instead, he demanded composure, service, and the strength to carry pain without allowing it to control duty. That lesson mattered, because the monarchy depended on restraint. Same one person's grief could not be allowed to reshape the rules protecting everyone else. Harry remembered something different. He had known a grandfather who respected courage, recognized anger, and understood the desire to challenge tradition. Yet, Philip had also warned him more than once that personal suffering did not erase responsibility. The difference between those memories now stood at the center of the crisis. One brother remembered the warning. The other held tightly to the recognition. Harry waited in silence for the palace response, convinced the forbidden designation would prove that he still belonged inside the royal story. The phrase "Guardian of the Crown" sounded powerful, but it was not a legal title. It carried no rank, inheritance, or official power. To him, however, it represented something deeper, a private promise that he had never stopped serving. Even after stepping away, William felt betrayed by that belief. Harry had taken a memory shared by both brothers and turned it into pressure against the institution they had been raised to protect. The future king did not see a wounded grandson seeking recognition. He saw a deliberate attempt to use Philip's name as a key. Charles finally asked his elder son to meet alone. No aides entered. No advisor recorded the conversation. The king turned the copied request face down and admitted that his father had once used the phrase during a private family discussion, but he had never granted it as a title, never promised it to Harry, and never intended it to become a source of power. William watched grief tighten the monarch's voice. Charles then repeated the memory preserved in a documented account from one surviving palace advisor. Philip had become deeply concerned that his words might someday be separated from their warning and used out of context. The king placed one hand on the page and spoke quietly. Harry had mistaken affection for appointment. William heard the sadness, but he refused to soften. The problem was no longer what their grandfather had said. The problem was what happened after he said it. The forbidden title had not emerged from nowhere. It had been born during one bitter night, when Philip issued Harry a warning the prince never forgot. Years before Harry's demand arrived at Windsor, a private family ceremony had ended in humiliation. The guests had departed. The music had stopped, and Prince Philip asked his grandson to remain behind. What followed was not a blessing or secret appointment. It was a warning. Yet one sentence spoken during that encounter would later be remembered differently by each man, and eventually become the foundation of Harry's attempt to force his way back. Harry had challenged the palace openly after a private military remembrance ceremony, demanding to know why his formal position had been reduced. The event honored service and sacrifice, but his place within it had been carefully limited. That mattered, because a formal position was not simply a seat or uniform. It was a public sign of who still carried official responsibility on behalf of the crown. Philip waited until the family had left before speaking. He believed the younger royal was beginning to confuse recognition with service, and he feared applause had started to matter more than duty. Harry, already wounded, accused the institution of rewarding obedience while ignoring sacrifice. His grandfather did not soften. He answered that sacrifice lost its meaning when a man announced it every time he felt unseen. Harry felt the words cut deeper than any palace decision. He asked whether he would ever be trusted to protect the monarchy in his own way, rather than William's. The question carried years of resentment. One brother had inherited the path ahead. The other believed every path left to him had been narrowed by comparison. Philip studied him before answering. He said, "Every royal man must become a guardian of the crown." The phrase sounded like recognition, but he immediately explained its meaning. It described a personal responsibility to defend the monarchy through restraint and service. It was not a title, inheritance, appointment, or source of power. Harry heard the first sentence. He resisted the second. Philip removed his glasses as his grandson reached the doorway. Then the late Duke gave the warning that would later define everything. Private affection must never be used as public permission. Harry paused. He did not turn around. He left carrying the words that made him feel chosen, while burying the warning that denied him power. The room remained heavy after the door closed. According to a documented account preserved by a senior palace secretary, Philip immediately dictated a secret instruction. The instruction was a private written order, intended to stop the phrase from becoming formal royal language. He feared it could one day be lifted from that conversation and used during a family dispute. That fear had now become reality. Harry had built his return on half a memory. William was about to confront him with the missing half. The past had finally returned to Windsor, and this time the two brothers would be forced to argue over Philip's legacy face to face. There were no secretaries, legal advisors, or palace workers between them when William entered the private chamber. Harry was already waiting. On the table lay the request, bearing Prince Philip's forbidden designation. Neither brother reached for it. The argument began quietly, with controlled voices, and carefully chosen words. Then Harry claimed their grandfather had chosen him for a duty William could never understand, and the future king's restraint finally collapsed. William had agreed to the meeting for one reason. He wanted his brother to withdraw the title before the dispute became an official royal decision. That mattered, because an official royal decision was not a private family opinion. It was a formal decision made in the name of the crown, one that could close the door permanently. Harry refused to bend. He said he had not claimed a noble rank which meant a position granted or inherited within the royal system. Guardian of the crown, he argued, was different. It was a moral duty Philip had entrusted to him personally, a responsibility that existed beyond palace approval. William heard only manipulation. He accused his brother of using their grandfather's memory as a key to reopen doors that had been closed because of Harry's own choices. The prince said affection had been turned into leverage, and grief into a challenge against the monarchy. Harry's anger rose. He answered that William had inherited the future, the power, and the family's protection. He had inherited only the truths nobody else wanted spoken. The accusation landed hard, but the future king did not move. William reached for the secret instruction. It was a private written order, dictated after the remembrance ceremony, designed to prevent Philip's words from becoming a formal title. He slid it across the table. Harry refused to touch it. The prince read the crucial sentence aloud. Philip had forbidden the phrase from being claimed as an inheritance, appointment, or source of power. The words were clear. There was no promise, no succession, no secret power. Harry stared at the page and accused palace officials of adding the warning because they feared the power their grandfather wanted him to hold. For a moment, certainty replaced reason. He insisted the institution had rewritten the conversation to protect William. That was when restraint broke. William pulled the return request toward him, removed the duplicate signature page, and tore it in half. He told his brother the original would still be formally rejected. Then he delivered the sentence Harry had feared most. Philip was not appointing him. He was warning him. Harry's anger disappeared for one brief second. Shock took its place. But he still refused to withdraw the claim. The brothers had reached the point where words could no longer contain the damage, and only the king possessed the power to end it. King Charles had spent years hoping that time might achieve what private conversations could not. He wanted reconciliation without surrender, compassion without humiliation, and a path that allowed Harry to return without weakening William. The forbidden title destroyed that fragile hope. Now the king faced a decision more painful than anger, whether to protect his younger son from permanent exclusion or protect the monarchy from a claim built upon Prince Philip's misused words. Charles alone could decide whether the request moved forward or died before reaching the wider royal household. That power mattered, because formal consideration would give Harry's claim a level of recognition it did not deserve. Even allowing the phrase to enter official discussion could make a private family memory look like a source of royal power. William made that danger clear. He warned that accepting any part of the submission would create a precedent, allowing private remarks to be turned into power whenever someone felt wronged. The prince believed the line had to be drawn now. Anything softer would invite the same challenge again. Charles heard the argument, but he also heard a son asking to come home. The monarch was devastated that Harry had invoked Philip because his father had despised emotional pressure and invented privilege. Yet the king feared William's fury could turn necessary discipline into permanent punishment. One son wanted protection. The other wanted finality. Camilla spoke carefully during a private consultation. She reminded Charles that the issue was no longer only Harry's return. If guardian of the crown was acknowledged, even informally, it could appear to create a rival source of royal legitimacy. The queen consort understood that legitimacy meant the accepted right to act with royal power. Once confused, that right could damage the entire line of succession. A legal expert then confirmed the harshest option. The crown could formally declare the phrase extinct, meaning it would carry no recognized status in future correspondence, ceremony, or public representation. According to the written legal briefing, the decision would close every possible route for the designation to return. Charles lifted his pen. Then he stopped. The king asked everyone to leave. Alone, he read Harry's name again and stared at the space where Philip's words had been used as leverage. The silence stretched. Finally, the monarch pressed the pen onto the rejection and signed. William returned expecting certainty. Instead, he found exhaustion. Charles told his heir that protecting the crown could still feel like losing a son. The prince lowered his anger, but not his resolve. Within the hour, the rejection was sent. Attached to it was a second order Harry had never expected. Charles had signed away the disputed title, but the punishment attached to that decision would strike Harry far harder than the words of rejection. Harry expected his request to be challenged. He did not expect the palace to close the final channel that still connected him privately to Windsor. The king's order rejected the forbidden title, denied the demand for a restored position, and suspended the secret family access Harry had retained for emergencies. As he reached the final paragraph, his anger vanished. For the first time, he understood that this was not another warning, it was a consequence. Harry read the official decision again. Guardian of the Crown had been declared a personal expression, linked only to Philip's service, not a hereditary, formal, or legal position. In simple terms, it gave no one the right to inherit power, appear in royal ceremony, or act on behalf of the monarchy. The rejection went further. Harry's request for renewed access to Windsor had been refused because he had submitted it through a disputed designation that challenged established royal power. He had tried to turn a private memory into an official key. The palace had now broken that key in public and in law. Harry's first reaction was fury. He accused William of shaping every line and pushing Charles toward the harshest possible outcome. Then he reached the final page and saw his father's signature beneath the order. The anger weakened. His certainty collapsed with it. William received confirmation that the decision had been delivered. The prince had demanded firm action, yet victory brought no relief. He left his advisors behind and stood alone, knowing the order had achieved what years of arguments could not. Harry had been stopped, but the pain driving him had not disappeared. Harry kept reading. The decision suspended his secret Windsor contact office, a secret route that had allowed urgent family messages to bypass normal palace procedure. From that moment forward, every approach would pass through formal channels, meaning workers, written records, and official approval would stand between him and the family. Then Harry found the separate note. Charles had written it by hand. The king said the door to family remained emotionally open, but the door to royal power was now closed. The words did not reverse the punishment. They made it more painful. His father was not rejecting him as a son. He was refusing him as a royal figure. Harry finished reading and folded the note with trembling hands. He placed it apart from the official rejection instead of tearing it apart. That small decision revealed what anger could no longer hide. The message still mattered, because the father behind it still mattered. William learned that the note had been preserved. The future king understood the meaning immediately. His brother was wounded, but not finished. Harry then made one final request. He did not ask for another palace review. He asked to speak directly with Charles as his father. With titles, advisors, and official channels removed, father and son were left with nothing, except the truth they had avoided for years. There was no royal desk between them, no uniform, no advisor waiting to record the outcome. Charles met Harry privately, not as king and subject, but as father and son. Harry arrived prepared to defend Philip's words once more. Yet when he saw the exhaustion on the king's face, his rehearsed argument faltered. The meeting became something neither man expected. Not a negotiation over return, but a reckoning over what had been lost. Charles had agreed to the conversation only after his younger son accepted one condition: the royal decision would not be reversed, softened, or renegotiated. That mattered, because the rejection was no longer a family disagreement. It had become a formal act of the crown, meaning a decision made through the power of the monarchy itself. Harry entered without William, Camilla, lawyers or workers present. For once, no institution stood between them. No aide could reshape a sentence. No advisor could turn emotion into policy. The silence forced both men to speak plainly. Harry admitted that using Philip's phrase had been his attempt to prove he still possessed a purpose within the family. He said he had spent years being treated as though leaving royal duty meant losing every part of his identity. The title, forbidden or not, had felt like proof that his grandfather once saw value in him. Charles listened without interruption. Then the king answered, "That purpose could not be recovered by claiming power another man had deliberately refused to leave behind. Philip's affection had been real. So had his warning. One could not be remembered while the other was erased." Harry's expression changed when his father revealed the rest. According to a private conversation later preserved in a documented family account, Philip had spoken to Charles after the Windsor confrontation. The late Duke feared his grandson would remember the praise and reject the correction. He worried those words would one day become a weapon. The truth finally broke through. Harry admitted he had always known Guardian of the Crown was never an official title. He had used it because he believed forcing the palace to recognize the phrase would also force William to recognize him. He had not been fighting only for access. He had been fighting against the feeling that his brother no longer saw him as necessary. Charles reached across the table and turned the rejected request face down. He told his son that a brother could not be forced into trust through a borrowed name. Harry's anger gave way to sadness. He withdrew the claim verbally and promised never to use the designation again. His royal position remained lost. The decision stood, but the battle over Philip's legacy was over. Inside the room, the dispute had ended with painful honesty. Outside it, the world was preparing to turn that grief into a royal spectacle. By morning, the private conflict had become a national argument. Some saw William as the defender of royal order. Others saw Harry as a wounded grandson, clinging to the only language of belonging he still possessed. Yet one image dominated every broadcast. The gates of Windsor closed beneath a newspaper headline, announcing that Prince Philip's forbidden title had been extinguished by royal command. The family's pain had become public property. Palace communications confirmed that Guardian of the Crown held no legal or formal status and would never be recognized in any royal capacity. A formal status is an official place within royal events, duties, or public representation. The statement also confirmed that Harry had withdrawn the wording, but it gave no details about his private meeting with Charles. William's supporters praised the decision as proof that the future king could protect the monarchy even when the threat came from someone he loved. They argued that private memories could not override legal order because the crown would become unstable if affection could be turned into power. To them, the prince had chosen discipline over emotion. Harry's defenders saw something darker. They argued that personal estrangement and palace power had become impossible to separate. He had lost access, recognition, and the last secret route into Windsor, all while trying to prove that he still mattered to the family. His mistake was serious. His punishment felt final. A major broadcaster then delivered the phrase that changed the public debate. During a live morning bulletin, the dispute was described as the moment William chose the crown over his brother. The title controversy was no longer being discussed as a technical question. It had become a test of what kind of king the prince might one day become. Harry answered with silence. Palace workers had prepared for a statement, an interview, or another public challenge. Nothing came. His refusal to strike back revealed more than any denial could have done. Something decisive had happened in that private conversation with Charles. and the younger son had accepted an ending he once believed he could overturn. Outside Windsor Castle, a crowd gathered beside the Long Walk as the evening newspaper appeared. Its front page carried 6 words: "Philip's name cannot be used as a key." An elderly veteran read the headline, folded the paper carefully, and said, "Duty could not be inherited through anger." William saw the same words before a public engagement. The future king closed the newspaper, steadied himself, and walked forward without answering a single question. The noise outside Windsor demanded a winner, but the final verdict would reject both Harry's claim and the idea that Philip's legacy belonged to any one man. The final declaration did not grant victory to William, humiliation to Harry, or ownership to the institution. Instead, it restored Prince Philip's words to their original meaning. Guardian of the Crown was formally recognized as a description of service, never a title, position, inheritance, or source of power. Harry's claim was withdrawn. William's order remained. Charles's decision became final, and the monarchy emerged with a painful lesson about loyalty, memory, and the danger of borrowing power from the dead. The palace permanently recorded that Philip had created no inheritable designation and appointed no successor to such a position. An inheritable designation would be a title or position passed legally from one person to another. The final record made the truth unmistakable. His phrase described duty, not ownership, and no family member could ever claim power through it again. Harry's request for renewed official access remained rejected. Yet, Charles separated that decision from their private relationship, making clear that legal discussions concerned royal power, while family conversations concerned love, regret, and forgiveness. The king would not reopen the path to power, but he refused to pretend that fatherhood had ended. William accepted that defending the crown had required firmness. Still, the prince admitted during a recorded private conversation with Charles that anger alone could never rebuild trust. He had protected the monarchy's boundaries, but he also understood that defeating his brother's claim was not the same as healing the wound between them. Harry finally accepted responsibility. He acknowledged in a written message that he had presented a personal phrase, as though it carried formal power. The younger royal did not regain his position, his access, or his former power, but he stopped fighting the final decision, and that surrender ended the battle Philip had feared. Charles then ordered the original instruction and the full documented account of the Windsor conversation to be preserved together. No one would ever again repeat the praise while hiding the warning. The monarch also ruled that private family memories could not support future royal claims unless confirmed through established legal power. Then one final message arrived. Harry wrote to William, "I should not have used his name that way." The future king read the words, placed his phone down, and answered only, "I know." Charles learned that the reply had been sent. The king closed the family file and allowed himself one quiet breath. Reconciliation remained incomplete, but the conflict was over. Royal belonging could not be forced through pain, forbidden titles, or borrowed memory. William preserved the crown. Harry surrendered the false claim. Charles chose duty without denying love. Philip's legacy remained where he intended it to remain, not in a title, but in service. There was no hidden claim left unresolved. Harry withdrew. William stood firm. Charles delivered the final judgment, and Philip's name could never again be used as a weapon against the crown. Thanks for watching Victoria Windsor. Please do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel for all the latest royal family news and updates, and we will see you in the next video.